Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks a lot for your presence, and thanks to the organizers, to Fabrice and Charles and all the organizers to allow us with this opportunity to tell you about what we are doing in the WAVES group in Ensenada. So the WAVES group is as co-authors in this talk, Pedro Osuna, Nicolás Rascal, Guillermo Díaz from the Physical Oceanography Department in CICESE, and also some colleagues like Reginaldo, Hector, and Bernardo from the University of Baja California, as well in Ensenada, plus some postdoc and grad students. Moda, Peláez Zapata, Herrera, and Larios. So I must say that the research that we are doing is essentially supported by a contribution from the National Research Council in Mexico and the Ministry of Energy through two projects. And my talk will be like this. I'll give you some ideas of our motivation briefly, and I will talk a little about the background, essentially some relevant results from an experiment that we did a few years ago. Now it is more or less a classical experiment. It is a historic experiment as well. And later on, I will tell you about this new opportunity on studying air-sea interaction and doing measurements, essentially thanks to this initiative through the National Research Council and the Ministry of Energy in Mexico. And it's a consortium, a research project, which becomes a consortium of research in the Gulf of Mexico. So, and the second part of my talk, I will show you some preliminary results from pilot experiments that we are performing near Ensenada. I must say that we have a lot of data and work is still under progress. And finally, I will talk about next steps. So regarding the motivation, is essentially the research interest in the WAVES group in CICESE is studying and understanding ocean surface waves and also the relevance to other air-sea interaction processes. We recognize the relevance of this type of phenomena, ocean surface waves, in many air-sea interaction processes. These are fundamental aspects of many present challenges to many things like weather, climate and its changes, especially if we want to forecast them or predict them or make projections, and also in marine applications and energy and so on. And we also recognize that everything around the sea surface, the interface between the atmosphere and the ocean, is rather linked. We have to understand the lower atmosphere, we have to understand the dynamics of the sea surface, which is essentially ocean surface waves, the momentum transfer between the ocean and the atmosphere, and what happened also in the upper ocean currents. But also, we need to establish details about the turbulence, which is also affecting, especially around both sides of the interface. And this time, we will talk a little about we have been observing in the water side. So we know that better knowledge is desired and it is needed, all of these aspects. And we know also that it is a great opportunity to measure all relevant variables from space. That's what we are here. And we also recognize that ground truth, of course, is always needed and welcome. And that's what we do. So as a background, I'll tell you a little about this, the air-sea interaction experiment, which was carried out in the Gulf of Tehuantepec in Mexican waters. And this is a very particular area because there are times when there is a high pressure in the Gulf of Mexico or a front that pushes air through this isthmus, which is low mountain gap, and then induces an offshore jet of moderate to strong wind, imposing a very characteristic ocean dynamics. Yeah. And of course, waves are generated locally, and in this area, as you can imagine, we have swell, essentially from the south. So most of the time, we have swell opposing the locally generated waves. So in that time, we deploy one of these spar buoys designed by the group in Miami, Donnellan and Graver et al. And we had a field campaign a few years ago, more than 12 years ago, something like that, where we measure wind speed, surface height, elevation, waves, and the buoy motion at 20 hertz, and other parameters at 1 hertz. So we deploy the buoy near shore, 20 kilometers offshore, at a depth of about 60 meters. And essentially what we did was in 30-minute runs, we applied the motion correction and obtained wind velocity, surface heights, and so on. And we managed to determine the momentum flux or wind stress directly from the turbulent fluctuations of the wind measurements. So that was rather interesting. And among other results, we found that there was a difference between the angle between the stress and the mean wind. And this is a plot of this difference as a function of wind speed. So we gathered that, well, if it is a moderate or strong wind, the stress is aligned to the mean wind, but it's not the case for rather low or rather low wind. And we thought that it was very much wave dependent. If it is swell dominated or wind sea dominated or a mixture of the two, then these plots were clustered. Besides that, we did some further analysis and we determined that the wind stress, this is in terms of mu star, as a function of the significant wave height of the locally generated waves, was also dependent on the swell conditions. And these plots are typical swell steepness, decreasing from 0.0024 down to 0.0038. So we can notice a subtle change in the slope of this line, telling us that the swell had an influence on that. So we did some further analysis, and we published several papers, and we agree upon main issues like we had a nice range of wind speed and important variability in the region. And we also have unique conditions of wind sea and opposing swell. But definitely, our measurements, at least in the time we had there, were limited in swell steepness and also variation in wind and wave, wind sea and swell directional variability. And we decided to explore other relevant processes. So now we have the opportunity with this initiative by the National Research Council and CONACYT to study further air-sea interaction. So we are developing this type of buoy, and we have already tested 3. The first one is has been deployed in the Gulf of Mexico in this area on middle of July this year. And the number 2 had already passed a period of trial test in this site where we deploy the pilot experiments. Number 3 is still there making measurements. So the idea is from this big initiative or project to establish a network for oceanographic observations, physical, geochemical, ecological, and so on, to generate scenarios upon exploration and production activities of offshore oil in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a rather big project, and the buoy is a small part that I'm in charge of. So we are building and enhancing this type of spar buoys with new electronics developed in our lab. Of course, we include more sensors, and they have essentially a sonic anemometer, metastation. We measure air and water CO2 concentration. It has six capacitance wave stuff and a kind of CTD with oxygen and pH sensors as well, and ADCP and a point current meter at the bottom of the structure. The ADCP is looking upward, slightly tilted to avoid the structure in order to have a detailed structure of the current profile. So within the electronics, we have this very fine 6 degrees of freedom motion sensor, and it has rechargeable batteries and a wind generator and solar panels. And in some point, we would like to include in one of them a CO2 sensor with fast response and a couple of video camera systems. And looking for several conditions where we have variability of waves, we are lucky that we have this type of waves in Ensenada, while the bomb number 3 is already on. This is Terasar X image obtained on the 6th this month, and we also have conditions where swell is more or less dominant. But I'm going to tell you a little about the result that we had with the first trial period of the first buoy, with the idea to try to get a variety of surface wave conditions and find or study the link between the wave spectra and the turbulent kinetic energy dissipation rate. So if we have as a reference the theoretical aspects of the turbulent kinetic energy dissipation rate, we can see that we could obtain some of these terms by measuring the microstructure in a profile. Also from theory, we have the law of the wall, where is more or less a description, a bulk description of the turbulence. And we have the momentum fluxes from the atmosphere, what we can establish with, from the buoy. And of course, we can also estimate the energy flux from the waves to the ocean, maybe in terms of currents, as this partially theoretically. I must recall that this work is mainly results of the Daniel Peláez MSc thesis. So for this, we deployed this type of buoy in Ensenada. It's in an area of 100 meters depth over there. And this buoy had the typical sensor that I mentioned before, a weather station, a sonic anemometer, and the capacitance wires. The inertial motion in the electronics, and the measurement period was from November to February, November last year to February this year. We also had the opportunity to use this microstructure profiler to look at the velocity shear as a function of the depth. And we managed to perform several campaigns and obtain some interesting results. The typical conditions of the area are not that huge or strange or extreme. Winds are moderate, low to moderate, say, maximum winds of 10 meters per second or so on. Significant wave height also low to moderate. The maximum event was more or less 4 meters in significant wave height. And we didn't manage to get these profiles of the vertical microstructure only towards the end of this campaign, where this dotted line, dotted line are sketched. And to get the dissipation rate, the turbulent kinetic energy dissipation rate, there is this procedure that maybe not worth to look at, to go through in detail. But the final point is that it is possible to obtain a mean profile after some quality control and data analysis, and from this spiky and noisy signal. So what we obtain is this turbulent kinetic energy dissipation rate, and this is plotted as a function of depth. Maybe you cannot see the dots. The gray dots are individual values, but then the average is this dark line. For typically different significant wave height conditions, in this case 187, and this case 0.73 and 0.62. And the wind speed was rather similar, more or less 5 meters per second, 5.3, and 4.5. And the thing is that we can explain, or we try to explain this profile through these methods, the law of the wall, an idea of the production or dissipation of turbulent kinetic energy, including the Stokes drift, and parameterization of these two authors, which kind of include the wave effect. And the results are sketched at the color lined. So low the wall is the red, including the Stokes drift is the blue, and the green one is the parameterization by Wan and Kiao. So here we can see that maybe in some cases this Stokes drift idea resembles the profile, but in some others it doesn't. And in these two cases, it looks more like the low the wall makes a rather good job. But if we compare this with similar wind but higher waves, we can see that the Stokes drift perform or describes much better or better the profile. So the idea is that, of course, the waves are needed to explain what it is happening just below the sea surface. And if you can see back and forth, we can see that the profile gets better explained by this idea. So we still don't have a very critical or extraordinary conclusions. And we would like to say is that the work is still under progress and results are under further analysis. The current measurements are still under processing. Remember, we have two types of measurements of currents with ADCP and one single point measurement. And but we want to stress that there are great needs to perform detailed direct measurements, and we are preparing or getting prepared for CalVal activities somewhere, especially in Mexican waters. We plan to deploy our SPAR buoys in Mexican waters in this year, and to study air sea interaction, momentum fluxes, directional waves, and currents in the upper part of the water column. Thank you very much.
Okay. Any question? Okay, Craig. That's the usual.
So great. So assuming that positively SKIM is selected, we need to entrain you to get on board the SKIM mission preparation, and then we can do some nice experiments out with your kit.
We would like to do that.
And as long as I can come to the Gulf of Twantepec.
Yeah, we would like to do that. Yeah. Why not?
Not on a bad day. Not on a bad day. Just a quick comment. How do you compare with the directionality of the stress, the fact that you found always something, when you have mixed seas, you have a change in the wind stress direction compared to the wind direction. Mm-hmm. Do you interpret it, how do you interpret it with your, within your framework?
For that particular case, for the experiment we had in the Gulf of Tehuantepec, we didn't manage to get a detailed character of the directional wave spectrum. So it was a shame because we lost a few wires, and that's critical. Yeah.
Okay, so Fabrice told me that they broke the wave gauge.
The what?
You broke some wires, right?
Yes. Yeah.
After a few days. Okay.
So we left with maybe 3 wires for the whole period, which wasn't good enough for directional resolution.
Because the projection of the current on each of the wave component will affect also their stiffness and affecting.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's
and in that time, in the Gulf of Tehuantepec, we didn't have a current meter in the buoy. Now we have. So we are much better, in better shape, and the wave staffs are also more robust.
Yes.
How do you get the directionality?
So
it is a 6 wave staff. So this is a very nice method to get the directional spectrum.
So
written by Donnellan and colleagues.
Okay.